Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I noticed Nuxanor recently made a video covering the More Pegasus video about Logan Paul and CryptoZoo, which perhaps isn't a coincidence to have occurred shortly after I mentioned him in my last release on this podcast. Since I've now mentioned two YouTubers who have brought up this stuff with Logan Paul and CryptoZoo, how they did, I find it perhaps worth mentioning that I do not believe the YouTuber CoffeeZilla is being disingenuous or intentionally trying to mislead the government with his reporting the whole CryptoZoo thing. Again, I've never had and or wanted to have any part in CryptoZoo, nor do I have any particular inclinations to defend or even generally favor Logan Paul. I also have never and do not have any real reason to have any issue with CoffeeZilla. Also, I don't consider myself a hater of Nuxanor nor of Pegasus, although I continue to have difficulty understanding why they're for some reason so preoccupied with covering even things that have already been covered by the other, instead of ever even once giving my efforts any direct exposure, especially when I clearly could use it by far the most. I've already determined Pegasus seems cucked by Emain, or maybe it's Hassan. Nuxanor seems to just have some weird thing in his politics where he has issues with LGBT individuals. In the same video, Nuxanor was reacting to the More Pegasus video about Logan Paul and CryptoZoo. Nuxanor explicitly expressed even more concern about being attacked by the LGBT community than even literally three-letter government organizations like the FBI and CIA, which I imagine can't be a coincidence. I don't know exactly what's going on there, as I obviously don't associate with or consider myself friends with either Pegasus nor Nuxanor nor any of their friends. I don't care enough to find out what their problem with me is, honestly. I'll just document Nuxanor as another person I'll end up suing and pressing criminal charges against unless he can actually explicitly produce a decent reason to prioritize laughing at obvious grifters like Logan Paul, and then probably go off onto other topics like Pegasus did, instead of bringing attention to someone like me in extremely life-threatening deprivation who clearly needs substantial attention brought to the issue in order to ever even have a real chance at anything even really resembling justice. I noticed Destiny recently tweeted this strange, almost sarcastic seeming message about Iraq War 2001 and manufactured consent. Dixon is from Iraq, and his criminal falsification of my consent to his highly criminal life insurance fraud he committed by exploiting his connection to me entirely at my expense against my consent would be classified as manufactured consent, I'd imagine. I also saw reason to suspect that manufactured consent has ultimately cascaded into egregious, negligent Canadian government spending I should perhaps shed some light on at this time. Back when he was running his own business, Dixon ran a screen printing business called Impressions 2000 Inc., which I don't know why he decided to name as such. But if we were to consider a strange web of narratives where the start of this podcast somehow equates to the year 2000 among them, and make what I imagine is a reasonable assumption that Dixon named his business in relation to the year 2000. Considering strange narratives that appear to empower Dixon have been attempting to make me seem like I want to rewind time to before I started this podcast, I suppose it makes sense to suspect those narratives currently consider their hallucination of the current year to currently be 2001. And Destiny must currently be dealing with some complex politics around all that, which must involve offline TV and friends among it all. The first time I ended up homeless after Dixon literally threatened to murder me in front of Kristen because I refused to knowingly enable and facilitate Dixon's efforts to criminally coerce Kristen into coming back into Dixon's house. I first inquired to Kristen about how he was surviving. He informed me of a youth shelter in downtown Toronto called Turning Point, which I ended up going to the day I finished packing my things and left Dixon's house and entered homelessness for the first time in my life. While I don't feel it's necessary for me to go into extensive detail about my experiences there, certain spiritual insights and activity that's been brought to my attention within the House of Commons has made it evident to me that sharing certain, perhaps most pertinent details may help in clarifying things. Apparently, the various contracts issued to GC Strategies totaled about $64 million in negligent government spending. From what I have heard, in many cases, the government has found no proof that the work was done that taxpayers paid for. Security clearances weren't in place where they needed to be in place. All procurement rules thrown aside, $64 million for an app that did nothing to keep people safe. There should be a lifetime ban for the company and its principals, but the Liberals initially voted against having the Auditor General even investigate. Discussion of a 7-year minimum ban for the company getting contracts indicates the relevant corruption was in motion from right around the time I started facing exceptional friction in my connection with Kimmy, although I first experienced homelessness long before then. In my time at Turning Point, I quickly befriended someone named Darren. I can't imagine Kristen hadn't already dealt with him before I even knew of him. Darren definitely was gay and very much attracted to men, and was honest to me about it in how he talked about being widely known in the area for his, well, basically being a whore, which he basically admitted to me himself in rather crude terms, even with his own wording. While Kristen didn't tell me specifically whose dick he sucked to try it out, in the conversation I'd had with Kristen where he'd randomly admitted to me that he'd done so, I now suspect it very well might have been Darren. I was just kind to Darren with only intent to be purely platonic friends and never communicated otherwise to him, although he seemed to strangely expect more from me as time passed, and also seemed to have a quite false sense of who I am, as if I'm shallow and greedy. I now suspect Kristen was running his mouth, egregiously defaming me to Darren, and possibly also others around him in downtown Toronto, as early as over a decade ago, before I'd ever been homeless. probably projected a bunch of his negative qualities onto me to try to garner sympathy from other homeless people, and probably contributed to why I ended up getting robbed of my phone at the time through coercion done by some criminal that basically acted like he was high-ranked in some gang he had ties to, who I imagine Kristen also likely met before I did. Kristen probably knew I'd end up homeless and had already started plotting how he was basically trying to sell me out to everyone around him. He basically set me up in a trap when he told me about that shelter. It seems some kind of collaborative, malicious effort involving Kristen and Darren, with heavy involvement of street politics, egregiously exploited me in a manner Kristen was likely hoping and expecting to ultimately get some kind of windfall as a result of, perhaps from gang members he befriended and or Dixon, Mary, and or John directly. You know, I always found it exceptionally strange how there was a point where Darren essentially passive-aggressively encouraged me to commit suicide by showing me a document he'd emailed himself and wanted to email me about how the most painless manner to commit suicide is apparently suffocating on helium. Like, why would I need to know that? Darren had no actually good reason to believe I was suicidal, at least certainly not as a result of anything I'd ever said or done. I don't identify with having white hair or even wanting to have white hair. But weird narratives around anime, which I've already determined relates to egregious exploitation of me by Kimmy and ultimately rooted in egregious exploitation of me by Chloe, seem to frame me as being and or wanting to be seen as some white-haired, tall, skinny male. Other spiritual insights seem to suggest to me that Big Skanger has been intentionally enabling and facilitating egregious false narratives related to me supposedly at all consensually having some kind of romantic and or sexual involvement with him. Those narratives most likely heavily relate to egregious defamation of me in false narratives that Lena has been exploiting visibly, publicly, in her strange obsession with the character Gojo. As I've already said, it seems to all come back down, ultimately, to egregious exploitation of me by Mary, Dixon, and John. But specifically, it seems narratives of me supposedly being attracted to men have somehow been fortified entirely at my expense against my consent through my experiences the first time I was homeless as a direct result of egregious defamation of me that Kristen engaged in fully consciously and intentionally entirely at my expense against my consent. It seems that somehow his gossip to Darren has ultimately manifested in my life, combined with Chloe's egregious, malicious gossip of me to Kimmy and her friends, as this strange situation of substantial confusion and tension I never wanted, needed, and or benefited from whatsoever between me and Big Skanger. It seems that Kristen's been projecting his homosexual tendencies onto me entirely at my expense against my consent so egregiously that he's been extremely seriously trying to make me seem like a horrible person somehow for not being attracted to men. It can't be a coincidence that he literally tried to convince me to try sucking dick before, which, for the record, I firmly, unwaveringly refused even the idea of, and to this day have absolutely zero desire and or willingness to ever do. I believe, perhaps for some people, they may feel they need to try it to know they don't like it. But for me, Personally, I just know I wouldn't enjoy it. I don't feel any need to try it to know I won't enjoy it. Kristen must have been telling people lies about me to have a much more comfortable and easy time being homeless. He probably justified it with the same extremely broken, brainwashed reasoning he used to justify being unbelievably pretentious and entitled towards me when we were living with Mary and later Dixon. Both of them clearly intentionally gave me an extremely hard time and brainwashed him to think I'm spoiled, entitled, delusional, and in the wrong for having the self-respect to stand up for myself against their abuse. They made him believe I was being abusive when I'd stand up against him, when he'd try to break down my mental health on behalf of them, like the pawn they'd tried to turn him into for them. I imagine he really didn't realize what he was getting himself into when he decided it was a good idea to cuss out Dixon for telling him to go to school instead of being a lazy loser playing League of Legends all day and messing around on Discord with his friends. Kristen was always so lazy, entitled, and unambitious that he seriously expected to just get to play video games all day while Dixon supported him and that extremely degenerate lifestyle, only being enabled by how Dixon would compare me to Kristen and say I was doing nothing all day, even when he could see I was programming practically every time he'd come to my room and check what I was doing. Who knows what Kristen went around telling people about me, probably trying to tell them all I'm some lazy, unambitious loser like him if I ever ended up homeless. It really must have been bad, too, how pretentious and fake he must have framed me to be. By the first night at Turning Point, I already had one guy visibly recognizing me as worthy of respect to the point of explicitly calling me serial killer guy on several occasions over time because he'd initially tried to intimidate me about if I was worried about what might happen at night, and I bluntly, casually just told him, "You're not going to murder me, so I'm not really worried." Even still, Kristen was strangely distant with me at the shelter, almost like we were strangers. The more I think about it, the more strange it all seems to me now, in retrospect. Years later, I'd gone through various improvements in myself and had chosen to talk to Dixon again, thinking maybe he was worth giving another chance to. Kristen jumped at the opportunity to freeload off my efforts that had effectively probably scared Dixon so much about my knowledge of certain things that he'd become afraid of forcing me to stay homeless, but insisted on acting like he wasn't. Ultimately, Kristen ended up leaving again, probably having gotten himself involved in street politics or whatever, to the point he preferred dealing with that instead of whatever Dixon was doing to him. I was already dealing with struggling against egregious defamation Kimmy and her associates were inflicting on me by that time, and with how it constantly drained all my time and energy to try to deal with, I preferred to avoid homelessness and any potential involvement with any street politics or dealing with anyone else in general, if at all possible. One time, Dixon left the house, and shortly after, I heard the phone ring. Something intuitively told me to pick up the phone and answer the call. The person on the other end talked about commercial junk removal arriving at the location shortly, but confirmed the residential address I was at. I immediately knew something was off. Dixon ordered junk removal to what he'd listed as a commercial address to the service to his own residential address shortly before walking out. That junk removal identified the residential address as his Impressions 2000 Inc. business? Something felt very wrong to me. I quickly grabbed my wallet and laptop and a couple other small things and quickly walked out the house, closing the front door behind me but leaving the door unlocked. As I turned the corner of the street the house was on, I saw 3 black cars following each other closely, one behind the other, driving up to and pulling into the driveway of Dixon's house. I didn't even waste time looking behind me to see those inside get out of their cars. I started sprinting away. A few minutes later, I saw Dixon driving back home. He noticed me and stopped to pick me up. I thought for a moment to just walk away, but I decided to get in his car instead. He asked me why I was outside. I told him the Shadow Confederation told me junk removal services were ordered to his address, and I didn't want any part of what he was involved in that caused that. He nervously tried to laugh it off and pretend he had no idea what I was talking about. When we got to the driveway of the house, none of the 3 black cars I'd previously seen were anywhere in sight. That's right. Not only were both Mary and Dixon extremely abusive, but it's far from the first time I've become aware Dixon has tried sending hitmen after me. From what I'm hearing spiritually, it seems Dixon and John have some kind of homosexual relationship secretly, and I imagine that's no small part of why they've both likely been quite substantially involved in sending at least some of the hits out on me that have been put out. From what I'm hearing, Dixon is in absolute shock that I'm still alive. I was supposed to be dead a while ago. He's always been an extremely disrespectful prick to me. Maybe I should be the one calling junk removal on him one of these days. Let's see where the Iraq War 2001 goes after that. Does the FBI really need me to inform them of the address I've last known him to be at, like how I reported John? Are they really so incompetent, or what? Anyways, I heard something really wild about someone who practices Babylonian black magic, feeling very regretful that they got someone pregnant. What the hell is Babylonian black magic as opposed to normal black magic? Did John get Chloe pregnant? I've seen reason to suspect that John is being forced to protect me to some extent because he got Chloe pregnant and I'm exposing her as being deserving of death, and that's putting his own life in danger for trying to attack me. Idiot. Goddamn disrespectful prick never respected anything I said about my power, even when I kept proving it to him. He looked down on Dixon for being unintelligent as some trashy guy from Iraq who married Mary because she was seen as some kind of prize for being from Iran. But John's still clearly quite uneducated as well himself if he couldn't see how much of an intellectual I am and how I've dealt with that entire family. It seems to me that John might be the Leo in the energy that previously was attempting to frame me for getting someone pregnant. Perhaps he thought I was just a coward or something in not wanting to get Chloe pregnant, and he thought I'd be jealous and or he could try to act like he did me a favor or something by getting her pregnant. He was just trying to control me, just like Chloe, each in their own ways. I most certainly never said or even implied to John that I want and or need him to impregnate Chloe and or anyone else. Ever. Also, going back to that strange energy telling me about Fuslie and Sykkuno being massive enemies to me and trying to destroy my life with Grand Theft Auto role-playing. There was also something about Chick-fil-A. No idea what that's about. Also something about Fallbrook, California. At least one of those I named as involved in trying to set me up in plots against me in Grand Theft Auto role-playing are most likely from there. Looking at Google Maps, it's quite a bit of a distance from Los Angeles, even driving. It seems Fuslie and Sykkuno have been trying very hard to egregiously misrepresent me as having some kind of obsession with Becca through their Grand Theft Auto role-playing, which has been heavily enabled and facilitated by John's egregious exploitation of me and criminal fabrication of contracts I never actually consented to. From what I'm hearing, it appears these false narratives were perhaps supposed to get me murdered by February 16th, or that's when they started a murder plot on me through them. The dates January 5th or 15th may also be relevant, although I'm really not sure how and can't recall any particularly striking relevance to those days in my personal life. I'm hearing a child is going to pass away because of this, because adults around that child will not stop sending me death magic, so it's backfiring and hurting innocent people. I'm hearing even more about at least some of those attacking me partake in ritualistic incest, so again more energy suggesting that those I once called family are a lot more disgusting than I ever knew when they were at all in my life. Their incest seems to be quite substantially related to the egregious false narratives about me, suggesting I'd ever be the type to go get involved in Grand Theft Auto role-playing under those fraudulent criminal contracts, trying to control me entirely at my expense against my consent. The person called Sandy might be a doppelganger of me who is possibly trying to suck up to me. Parents have bailed them out too many times to even count. They have now fallen into a trap. The person called McGee might dislike me because my good nature pisses them off. And something about false narratives that are trying to get me to walk right into a commitment with Ethel, share a double mission? That's not happening. The Truong person is apparently part of or has connections to an Asian gang trying to rub something in my face. The person called Aaron might have Tourette's and doesn't want anyone to know what they did. I don't want to spend much time or energy bothering about things probably related to stupidity, trying to trap me with Grand Theft Auto role-playing. I'm just saying those things to expose liars and demonstrate my lack of interest in actually engaging in it and or trying to manipulate parties involved to insert myself somehow into their stories. I'm hearing someone who loves to play pickleball needs my help but is afraid to ask. No idea who that is. Maybe it's a remnant of why Kimmy ended up playing pickleball until she hurt herself and had to stop. Also, apparently, someone who has placed me on a pedestal is bipolar and suicidal. If I had to guess, that's probably Chloe.